I believe, it has always seemed to me that this used to be the motivation for my LSD taking. It seemed to me that you could sit down in a room with someone and begin to, this is maybe what I'm trying to do with you, but we never get there. Sit down in a room with someone and begin to have a conversation that would take it apart. Take it apart and leave nothing there. At the end, no guru, no method, no teacher, and no nothing else either. I think that the world is held together by a misunderstanding. And that if you could overcome that misunderstanding, it would just fold up and deconstruct. And that in a sense, this is what the concept of enlightenment is. I think it's a series of insights or thoughts or revelations, one which projects forward into another, which leads you to just say, oh, it's not this, and it's not that, and it's not this, and then, yeah. Well, I guess the mundane plane is the misunderstanding. And I guess then if we analyze the mundane plane, we see what constitutes the misunderstanding. A belief in three-dimensional space and time, a belief in the finite life of the organism, and then the rupture of the mundane plane leads to this kind of Platonic superspace where there seems then to rest incontrovertible truths. They are not truths approached by logic and argument. They are self-evidently true. So they're either true for you or they're not true. And shamanism then sort of views all this very optimistically, takes the existence of this transmundane world as a higher world, a world in which healing can be done and the community can be made to cohere, and the shaman is essentially a technician, wiring and repairing and moving behind the board of culture, keeping all these lines open and together. Is that where your interest lies? Well, yes, I see. So apparently, it seems to me that it looks like mind is something that, if we were to make an analogy, it's somewhat like sulfur, in that sulfur has this weird quality of having two melting points. You have solid yellow sulfur and you heat it and it melts, but then you keep heating it and it turns back into a solid, and you continue heating it and it melts again. This is a curious property of sulfur, but not magical. The human mind seems to me to be like that. It's something that in the mundane plane, it has collapsed down into a tool for threat detection and social account keeping, basically. But when you go alone or with your nearest and dearest to wilderness or places where you feel secure, and you perturb the chemical foundations of consciousness, then this is the equivalent of heating the sulfur. And lo and behold, a new geometry is cast out of the fluid mercury of the psychedelicized mind. And I think I said this morning, I really favor a geometric model. I think that the shaman's power comes from the fact that the shamans really are seeing things from a higher dimensional perspective, that that's not a metaphor or an analogy, that that's the voice of mathematics speaking. And because as I analyze, the history of biology and higher animals and culture and so forth, what I see as a continuous theme from the very beginning is the conquest of dimensionality. life conquers dimensions. Life begins as a fixed slime in one place with no eyes, no ears, no nothing, and it evolves tactile awareness. Then it slowly becomes, through the sequestering of pigment-sensitive cells onto its surface, it acquires the notion of a gradient of light and darkness, and then through the formation of lenses, it's able to stabilize an impression of the exterior world. It evolves progressively with more advanced forms of locomotion. Eventually it evolves memory and complex cognitive interior maps for anticipating the future. This is a description of a strategy for the conquest of dimensionality. And I think really the shamans are the people among us who represent the next evolutionary level. They're people who have learned to do what we can't do, to come and go from hyperspace, whatever it is, an informational superspace that exists inside the psychology of the individual and the group that we can't even see, because we're materialists, fixated on the topological surfaces of the three-dimensional manifold, which is only one level in the onion of reality. These shamans have moved over to another level, but I think they are the paradigm for a new authentication of the human experience. And it's all about experience. This is what we clearly have wandered too far from. We are too in our heads. The consequences of a phonetic alphabet, monotheism, modern science, Greek aesthetics, yada, 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 is just to move us too far from experience. And so then this compensating thing is coming back in, and the shaman is the paradigmatic figure. And when you analyze what shamanism is, the psychedelic experience is revealed to be the sine qua non of this lifestyle. I've fiddled with screenplays. My objection to most visions of extraterrestrials is people don't understand. Extraterrestrials are not mundane. You know, they don't want our beautiful women. And they don't have a fascination with our gross industrial output. The real trick with an extraterrestrial is to know when you're in the presence of one, because it is going to be so strange and of such a different order of magnitude in many parameters that the trick is recognition, I think. I mean, eventually we may come to see that many life forms that we are not all to be traced back to one blob of germplasm, that, you know, the warm pond theory. I think the warm pond theory is in for serious revision. I think interesting genes have blown in here every once in a while over the millennia as the Earth has ground forward, and of course those genes get embedded in living systems. The mitochondria, which power the animal cell, were originally free-swimming bacteria that got into a symbiotic relationship with some kind of membrane-like matrix, and before they knew it, they had been incorporated as subcellular organelles of a larger system. Mind that this doesn't happen to you. Yeah. Well, isn't it? It's the role of the artist. It's to stretch the envelope. It's to bring the news from the edge. I mean, the musician, the shaman, the smith, the physician, these were all originally combined, you know, because the mystery of creation and the mystery of the human body, this was all spun together. That's why when people say, you know, what is the proper response to the culture crisis, I think the response is to shamanize. And that means, you know, to help with the healing, to explore the invisible world, and to make art, to try to make art, to try and anticipate the revelatory process by which the transcendental other is drawing the historical matrix into an ever clearer reflection of its identity, whatever it is. I mean, it's going to come through us somehow. We invoke it. We're boring toward it through the mountain of human history. It's boring toward us. We can anticipate it. It senses us. This is a real relationship here, but it's a relationship where illusion must be shed and shed and shed about what the other is.
You might be describing graffiti artists.
Well, it's not clear, as I say, it's not clear what the intent is. After all, what we now take to be the great canon of Western art were basically a fairly self-indulgent bunch of courtly types spiraling around producing public relations flackery for royal families. I mean, there are different ways of looking at the artistic enterprise in each time and place. Well, I maintain history is a self-limiting process, and that you can see the end from here. You know, you have to have a pretty complicated rap to deny that we are in some kind of unusual situation here, folks. Well, that suggests to me that this is awfully close to the surface of ordinary metabolism, considering what a shocking shift of consciousness it is. I mean, millions of people go to the grave without ever having a DMT trip unless they have it at the brink of the grave. That we don't know about. But the idea that in a dream such a shockingly extreme physiological response could be elicited means, I'll bet if we could do human work with DMT unfettered in an environment of biofeedback and that sort of thing, that you could teach people to have this experience. Well, that may be what it's all about. Is a non-invasive, non-drug technique for just opening up a portion of your brain that somehow cultural abuse has closed off to us, and that if we could access it, that would be the dream time, and that would be the entry into the domain outside of history. The Seth material. Well, I used to say if you can do this without drugs, you're probably mentally ill. I tend to take a hard view of it. I don't exactly understand the razzmatazz that surrounds it. I mean, I've talked with many entities. I've never felt the need to establish the spelling of their English name, or, this wish to name the entity puzzles me, or whatever. But I didn't then write a book and go on opera and say that I was channeling Dorothy and that the world should pay attention. It seems to me a curious relationship to your own mental life that you would say you were a channeler. I mean, it's just, these are the things we think, and it's a way of casting it. For instance, it never occurs to me, or it doesn't seem to me a very interesting question to say of the mushroom, is it the same person each time? I mean, what a joke. It's some kind of enormous intellectual agency. It's not a human being. That's the thing. The channeling, I guess my take on channeling is, and it will come out maybe tonight when we talk about the time wave, is that the real skinny is that you have a connection to everybody who ever lived. And there's a way of tuning your internal machinery in such a way that, here comes Marie Antoinette, or here comes Beethoven. But it isn't that Beethoven is a relative of yours, or still less that you were Beethoven. I mean, how likely is that, for crying out loud? It's simply that they're all there in some cultural superspace and can be reached and called down. I mean, they're an idea. Beethoven is an idea. You know, his grumpiness, the hands behind the back, the da-da-da-da, we know Beethoven. And so he lives in some kind of superspace. And I think people are just much too literal. I have this trouble with channeling and with flying saucer people and with the fans of Great Atlantis and the people who believe that, you know, lantern-jawed Neanderthal visages 10 miles high are gracing the deserts of Mars. All of this, the attraction of this kind of thing completely puzzles me because it's so hokey. And if you want the real thing, you know, it's just 5 dried grams away. The real thing. I mean, so that, you know, you will have done with anecdotes by the denizens of trailer camps in Florida about, or all of this other stuff. I mean, it's not that the woo-woo isn't out there. It's that it's so much more woo-woo than the beady-eyed peddlers of it assume that they just have no idea of what they're playing with. The New Age generally, I find, somewhat obnoxious because it's a flight from the psychedelic experience. I mean, what you can safely say about the New Age is if a technique doesn't work, they'll proclaim it. And it's certain, and I'm very much in favor of anything which breaks down the conceptions of ordinary medical practice. That's the most important part of the New Age. The attack on the medical fascism of the hierarchy. But people confuse science with reason and think that if you're anti-science, then you're somehow just permitted to go bananas. No. You can be anti-science, but nobody gets released from stuff like the rules of evidence. You have to make sense. Your position, whatever it is, just can't be sky blue. And you should then expect to be treated with the same respect as somebody who's gotten themselves epistemologically together and ontologically oriented. I mean, there are flaky ideas in this world. And that, people associate me with the New Age because that was the only place where I was originally tolerated. But I really want my ideas to be tested in the ordinary way, by the ordinary methods. I mean, I offer a mathematical formalism and then surrounding that a bunch of arm-waving verbal exegesis. The core thing is the mathematical algorithm to be tested by the ordinary rules of evidence and falsification. And, you can read Karl Popper to figure out what all that's about. I love science. I just think it's incredibly pretentious and has claimed too much. Its methods are great. Its constipated conservatism is maddening because what it deals with is the most interesting thing there is, nature. Nature is very, very interesting, complex, and permits all kinds of radical speculation about what has happened. It's just that science is also a business, and also a priesthood, and also a men's club, and also the plaything of certain classes. So all that has to be overcome. My method, I suppose, if method is the word which I would share with you, since this question about the New Age came up, is not to embrace things which are simply outrage bourgeois sensibilities, but to explore edges, to test edges yourself. That's the important, yourself. You don't learn about Tantra by reading about Tantra, or Ibogaine by reading about Ibogaine. You have to go and do these things. And what you will discover is, you will be fleeced a few times in your youth with this method. You'll get in with some flying saucer cult or some beady-eyed guru and his fanatical devotees, but eventually you'll learn the neighborhood and you'll become street smart and you won't be a mark. That's the goal of a real spiritual method, is to not be a mark. And then when you get that together, lo and behold, you would think this would lead to cynicism. Because you say, well, I went and I stayed with Babaji and he was a jackass, and then, I joined the Unitarian, Uniformitarian, Unifunctionalists, and that was just a scam, and so forth and so on. You would think it would lead to cynicism. Not if you keep to the edges. Because eventually you're going to come to psychedelics. And then, lo and behold, jackpot, the real thing, weirdness beyond all possibility to comprehend. You have just won the Publishers Clearing sweepstakes of peculiarity. Yeah. I had this happen in the 60s. I got into a place with LSD where I had this LSD and I would give my friends one and I would excuse myself and I would take one and then I would excuse myself to the bathroom and take 5 more. And then I would end up holding their hand all night long, and I felt weird about it. I felt like, where is all this stuff going? It's like it's not working. And when that happened to me, I just said it's time to dry out for a while. And I did, and then everything worked normally later. One of the weirdest things I've encountered is about 1 in 20 people don't react to DMT. And it looks genetic to me. I mean, I can't believe you could resist that. If it's coming at them the way it comes at me, nothing could stop it. And yet they will do it and take, enormous inhalations and then say, is this it? Or, I don't know, it's kind of strange, but it doesn't seem... And you're just like, oh my God, what is this? So, and one thing to bear in mind in all of this is that we talk a lot about the mental effects of drugs, but these drugs are tiny objects. They are molecules, and they won't work unless they find their way to your synaptic cleft and find waiting for them there what are called drug receptors. Think of them as little outlet holes into which the drug can plug itself. And how many of these little receptors you have is part of your genetic inheritance. And so some people have a lot, and some people have a little, and some people have some for some, and some have some for others. And you have to learn what works for you and what the right tool is. Yeah. Yes, toad is 5-methoxy-DMT. It's an exudate of Bufo alvarius, a large southwestern toad.
So it is DMT.
No,
the active ingredient?
No, it is not DMT. It's 5-methoxy-DMT, and it doesn't cause the same thing that DMT causes. It causes an intense, void-like emotion that is very dissolving, but it is not accompanied by the kind of visual activity that DMT... The visual activity on DMT is astonishing. I mean, it conveys you into a world more complex than the world we're living in, a world of brilliant colors and faceted surfaces. Yes, but on ayahuasca, unless it's really horrendously strong, you will never reach the kinds of places you reach on a DMT flash. Smoking it. No, there is nothing like that this side of the yawning grave, I hope. I mean, I don't know. Is everybody cognizant of what that's like, about how fast the world can be rearranged and how totally replaced it can be by something that you not only hadn't imagined until 30 seconds before that, you couldn't imagine. And now here it is. And you just gaze, you gape in slack-jawed disbelief at what has happened to reality. Oh no, it doesn't induce, somebody asked, is it dangerous? The danger with DMT is death by astonishment. This is an entirely possible outcome of your involvement with it, especially if you're intelligent. I think the more intelligent you are, the more at risk you are for death by astonishment, because you just say, good grief. Well, I'm pro-virtual reality just in the sense that I don't think it should be made illegal and stamped out. I think it should be a legitimate area of research. I certainly don't think most people should plan on decamping to virtual reality land for the rest of much of their lives. That wouldn't be a good idea. I see it primarily as a tool for studying language and communication. You never know where a technology is going to lead. When Edison invented the phonograph record, his sincere belief was that its major application would be in the making of wills, because you would have an incontrovertible record of the person's voice speaking, and so it wouldn't be legally contestable in court. Well, I don't know if anybody has ever made a will on a phonograph record, It clearly had an entirely different use and application. So here we've arrived at Sunday morning. This is basically loose ends, complaints, resolution, that whole bit. So let's work our way into it, and then if need be, I'll harangue. So anybody have anything they want to, yeah. I like understanding. I think, Whitehead said that understanding is the apperception of pattern as such. That's all, as such. And so you can look at any situation and see different patterns. I mean, like in this room, if we were sociologists, we could analyze where the women are and where the men are. And that would be a pattern, and we could talk about that. Then we could switch our field of interest and talk about where the men and women over 40 are and the men and women under 40, an entirely different pattern. Where the people wearing socks are and the barefoot people. And you realize that in any assemblage of objects, there's an infinite number of patterns of connection. And the more of them you see, the more you have this feeling which we call understanding. And it's a feeling of having assimilated the object to yourself. And the great mysterious assemblage, the mother of all weird assemblages, is history. The peregrinations of our species through time, and the detritus of that journey. I have a friend in London who's a rare book dealer, and when I'm in London, I'm usually able to contrive a situation where he has to have some errand out. And so then I'm left alone for hours with the books inside these multiple concentric circles of security, and I can open up all the cases and pour through this stuff. And it's astonishing. I mean, the cul-de-sacs into which the human mind has wandered, phlogiston theory, the Chaldean oracles, the Wunderkammer, the hollow earth thing, and then all this literature of exploration. I mean, the stratigraphy of the human experience is maps and machines and diaries and blueprints. And out of all this, if there can be a pattern, then there's a kind of an epiphany, a kind of a sense of order, of, aha, it does make sense. It isn't It isn't simply a chaos. Well, that's a Hindu notion of this same thing, essentially. This Platonic superdimension where all and everything is suspended and in place. If you ever want to have a very bizarre sub-psychedelic experience, when you're in Oxford, go to the Pitt Rivers Museum. Everybody goes to the Ashmolean, and of course you should, to see the Uccellos and all that. But on the kinkier side, the Pitt Rivers Museum. Pitt Rivers was an early ethnographer in England, and into one of those Victorian cast metal and glass-ceilinged buildings, he gathered hundreds of millions of objects classified by category. So, there are like 50,000 needles from all over the world in drawers, 10,000 pairs of pliers from all over the world, from all times and places, and on, and they're in drawers which you can open, and the stuff is stacked up 20 feet high, and you realize that it's a concentration of manas. It's a concrescence. There's one section where there are over 200 drawers labeled magical amulets. And you open these drawers and look, magical amulets, southern Iraq, magical amulets, Syria, and on and on. Very bizarre. That to me is, searching for pattern through the detritus of human history, because I really think that we are caught up in a relationship with something very, very mysterious. I don't like religious vocabularies, but an epiphany is taking place. Consciousness is really important, and it is using the stuff of biology to create some kind of new order in nature. And technology, I'm convinced, has something to do with it. That machines are more than they appear to be, and the machine, as we have known it, is to modern technology, is to a possible technology what the chipped flint is to the technology that we possess today. I mean, the concept of a machine, which is downloading of a function into matter, is a concept of immense profundity. Life may be able to extend its career by orders of magnitude through this means. And life is now seen to be, I think, clearly central in the evolution and the career of the universe. Most stars gutter out of existence after 500, 600 million years. That's the average lifetime of a star. We happen to be on a planet around an extraordinarily slow-burning and smooth-burning star that has lasted a long time. But life on this planet has been here for at least 2 billion years. That's 3 times the life of the average star. Biology is persistent. Biology is a major player. And biology is not entropic. A star, no matter how smooth burning and self-sustaining, is on a downward energy curve toward heat, death, and extinction. Biology, on the other hand, it pumps itself to higher and higher levels of complexity, faster and faster. And it uses the dying stars as stepping stones from one to another. The way, for instance, in the Hawaiian Islands, there's 30 million years of evolution visible, but no island out there has been above water more than 6 million years. The islands keep slipping beneath the sea and rising at the western edge of the complex, and the life keeps stepping from island to island and perpetuating itself. Hans Moravec has done calculations of the kinds of computational simulations that could be carried out if you had a computer where every atom was a switch and the computer was the size of the solar system. With a computer of that size, you could resurrect every DNA sequence that has ever existed on this planet. And he feels that you would feel a moral obligation so to do, and that the resurrection of the dead would become a social project pursued with government funding. Yeah. Well, I don't think Rupert would agree that biology is entropic. The way biology works is by being what's called an open system far from equilibrium. You see, a closed system, like a star or a fire, will always drift toward equilibrium, which is entropic. But the miracle of biology is that by taking in matter, by being an open system and allowing matter to come into the system and then breaking down that matter and extracting energy from it, the biological organism achieves the miracle of evading equilibrium. It hovers off the main curve of equilibrium. So people who talk about the third... What? Well, this is debatable at the highest level. There's a problem there because for some weird reason, the identifiable amount of matter in the universe falls so close to the cusp of of either it is open or it's closed that they can't tell. And why this is probably means there's something wrong with the theory. You know, Bridgman said a coincidence is what you have left over when you apply a bad theory. But I want to go back for a moment to this question of the open system far from equilibrium. The second law of thermodynamics, which was thought to be inviolate, states that all systems run down into entropy. But in practical terms, given the facts I just stated about how life is 3 times as persistent than the average star, and that if you view life on this planet as a single unified system of genes, then we have to say that there has been a dissipative structure, far from equilibrium. For 2 billion years, it's been able to maintain itself well off the entropic curve. So I think the second law of thermodynamics looks much more provisional from that light. Well, but see, it's been the third law that has been the downer. I mean the second law, because it seems to dictate some existential terminus to everything. But see, that's when you view the universe as matter. Here's another thing you have to lay over this. That all comes out of a materialistic view of the universe. If you view the universe as information, the picture becomes much more complicated. We don't really understand what this process is of symbolic signification, of arbitrary assignment of significant association. And it's not simply something done in human language. The codons of the DNA that code, the 3 nucleotide codons that code for amino acids that build proteins, are arbitrarily assigned at the molecular level. There is no inherent logic that says that guanine, 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 that codon, should code for what it does. It's entirely arbitrary, and yet out of that leap to arbitrary signification comes life itself. So we shouldn't assume, and it's a natural tendency to fall back into it, that we know what we're talking about. You know, that our intellectual journey through time has taken us to the level where we can actually glimpse what the basic ordering principle is. It may lie in language, not matter, yeah.
waiting for you to get to the political implications of all this.
Oh, well, I think I passed through it lightly, but let me take another stab at it. If my picture of things is correct, or even close, then the future is going to become considerably more dramatic from the middle 90s on. What we have directly in front of us is sort of the long golden garden party afternoon before the news arrives. And as the world gets more and more peculiar and improbable, and given the kind of things going on out at Jupiter that I talked about, this seems to be arriving on schedule, all this chaotic activity. There's going to be various political stances arise in relation to all of this stuff. For instance, one faction will say that nothing at all is wrong. This is, I think, what we see going on now, that there's a kind of collusion by governments and institutions to manage apocalyptic awareness, and to say, well, you don't need to worry about the fact that ozone is disappearing from the atmosphere, because by 2000 we will have a 7% reduction in output of CFCs, and by 2050 we're planning a further 7%. And you say, no, these are crazy people, obviously. There's a lot of arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic going on. But I think eventually that fluctuations, as the fluctuations become more violent, they will burst through, and political dialogues will start on various fronts. It's hard to say where it will come. For instance, historians of the breakup of the Soviet Union can reasonably argue that what actually the hole in the dike there was the Chernobyl explosion, and that actually set off a series of thought, of awareness. People's minds changed. It was like a psychedelic drug, this radiation spreading through Soviet society, because they realized, my God, this was a power plant. It was at ground level. It wasn't even a designed explosion. And 8 days after it happened, above Auckland, New Zealand, you could sample the radiation in the air. So there was a whole crisis of faith in the command economy, in everything. And this could happen. This will happen. The one thing you can be sure of is that the 90s will be shaped by the unexpected. Could be anything. A hot day in August in Mexico City and 1 million people die when finally all of these toxic levels come together as they potentially could. Or it could be a nuclear failure. Or it could be an assassination. Or it could be the outbreak of a synthetic disease. Or anything. And what this will bring home to people is that the metastable nature of society is beginning to break down, that the shock waves of the future are building up. And what in engineering an airfoil, engineers have to take account of what is called Q forces, vibration. If you don't design the airfoil correctly, as you approach the speed of sound, the wings of the airplane will be torn off. And so you have to redesign the airplane to move through this barrier. What we have to do is redesign the cultural airfoil so that we slip, what? What, you mean that it shouldn't support wrecking the third world? Pardon? No, see, I think that kind of thing is like talking about closing air bases near Sacramento and whether Western civilization can survive the shock of this loss of jobs. We're turning into an information society, and managers are trying to meet the crisis, but if my faith rested with human managers, I'd be frantic. The main thing is that the design process is being imposed by nature itself, just in the way that a supersonic aircraft has its design imposed by nature itself. The nature of the medium is dictating the shape of the society that is coming into being. The main thing is to try to make this through with as little bloodshed and hysteria as possible. It's a very hard call. I mean, looking at something like Bosnia, the impulse to use F-18s to correct the problem is very great. And yet, in the past, this has not brought joy and thanksgiving where it was used. And also the hubris of thinking that your job is to separate these people. On the other hand, we can't have people running around trading nuclear weapons in the red light district of Frankfurt, which is going on. This is actually going on. There is a great potential for chaos on the Eurasian landmass right now.